Hey everyone, so welcome to part three of the Big Bang mini-series. And in this piece, we're really going to be talking about the concept of evolution. And you might be wondering a little bit, like, why would we include evolution, the concept, in the series about the Big Bang, since the Big Bang seems like it's really about much earlier types of dynamics. We're just describing in the first two parts all these discussions about how the universe starts to unfold and like the process of creation a little bit, and how time is sort of like a construct that we experience, but really is, in essence, not really a clearly defined entity. It's simply a measure of change. And so evolution, the problem that we tend to think about with that, especially when we try to resolve evolution in its relationship with what we tend to think of as, well, religion. So evolution and religion, and evolution and the creation story. So if you remember already from the first two pieces in this series, so a lot of what I was trying to do was try to sort of unpack and illustrate how the whole idea of thinking about creation as if it's like this six-day series of 24 hours each was never really on the table as an option, and we're sort of just kind of coming to the story with a lot of assumptions that you have to really ask yourself where you got those assumptions from to begin with. And I think exactly the same thing is true about understanding evolution. So I just want to sort of show how evolution is actually much larger than what we think. We tend to think of evolution as about this sort of small problem. It's kind of like, well, did human beings evolve from monkeys? And that would be like a very serious problem. And if you're a religious person, that's usually how it's presented. But I want to sort of show how that's not actually a problem, even if that is true. And also, the perspective of evolution that we're using just to even think about this type of issue, this type of problem, is too small. There's a much larger perspective here to understand what evolution really is, and I think that we can kind of broaden our scope. It'll kind of make all these problems fall away, and it really reflects the principle that very often the problems that we experience simply cannot be solved at the level of thinking at which they are being created. And in this case, I just want to sort of start by pointing out that once again, I really think that the way that we as people who live by the Torah and learn the Torah and think about the Torah principles and the roots of the Torah and the underlying structures and systems of the Torah, as opposed to if you think, and I'm specifically specifying the systems perspective because that's really how you really know the Torah, is to understand it in its entirety and sort of see where all the parts fit together. And so when you're genuinely interested in the Torah in that way, that's very distinct from a lot of the pervasive cultural approaches and perspectives on both Torah and religion that are in the world. And the evolution question, I think, is a very, very primary example of this problem, where we kind of bring in the cultural and secular approach and perspective about religion versus science, and we bring it into like the Torah space where it truly does not belong in any way. So just to highlight and illustrate the problem really is that when you think about religion, so we think of human beings as being divine, or in some way divine, and this is the cultural approach generally. So then the idea that human beings simply came from monkeys, well, the corollary idea of that is, well, this all just kind of happened by accident, and there's just all these different animals, and they just accidentally became what they are, and through that process of accidents and mutations in the what we call the evolution process, so eventually by accident this thing was created, and our self-awareness, our intelligence, everything that we are simply was an accident. So, and that is, and that's sort of like and therefore you can't really even agree that evolution exists or happened if you are a religious person. So, and then usually the approach to that is, well, we can try to figure out a way to resolve this. Maybe evolution was the method that God used to make human beings, and that's all very nice, but I just want to sort of show how that's really like a very primitive beginner way of thinking about this problem, and there's a much bigger perspective here that's going on. So when you start learning the deepest principles of the Torah, what a lot of people like to call culturally today Kabbalah principles, so there's a massive structure that's kind of going on behind the scenes, and I just want to sort of highlight the kind of like the way that it operates and the way that it works really. So we already described how when you think about Hashem, so Hashem is kind of like beyond time, and that time is actually something which Hashem differentiated into being as an actual part of reality, as opposed to time existing and Hashem kind of within time, creating things, according to the timeline. So instead, the whole process of what we call creation is actually Hashem differentiating from a timeless, spaceless reality and essentially manifesting what we experience as this space and time continuum that we are within right now. So one of the kind of branches in terms of ideas that comes off of that inside of the system of the Torah is that there's almost like two different contrasting aspects to reality. And those two different contrasting aspects are actually reflected in the names of Hashem that are most centrally used by the Torah. So Hashem is called by one of Hashem's names, the main name that when we say the word Hashem, we're referring to the name Yud and Hey and Vav and Hey. We don't say the letters together. We also don't pronounce those letters. But that name, so I'm just going to call it from now on Yud K Vav K. So that name, that seems to denote how Hashem is timeless and spaceless. That Hashem is transcendent beyond all of the time-space continuum, the processed linear world that we experience. And you can actually see that in the name. We're not going to do too much of an analysis of the name right now, but that word, that is the Yud and the Hey and the Vav and the Hey, actually embedded in the word itself means the timeless and spaceless self that is beyond all of the process of being, which is a verb. Being is like, a process of being more and more. So Yud Kei Vav Kei is beyond process. It's beyond that type of thing, and it's timeless and spaceless. That self is simply timeless. Now, I'm also going to show you in a moment how to sort of touch that a little bit, but just to sort of put that on one side, and then on the other side, in contrast, is another name of Hashem, which is the name Elokim. And that word, the word Elohim, means a plurality of forces. There's all these different forces and things that are moving this way and pushing that way, and it's literally it's a plural word. If you look at the word, that's why it has the yud and the mem at the end, and so it literally means that there's a plurality of forces, multiplicity, diversity, whichever. All these different words describe sort of like what the word is about, and the word Elohim is really, it's about there being, like, even human beings are called Elohims in the Torah and in the later writings of the Tanakh, the other Bible writings, because we ourselves, this thing that we use, this set of tools that we're using, is actually a multiplicity of different forces. All these different muscles and tools, and they're all sometimes in conflict, sometimes they're in harmony, depending on how well you get this thing working. And so that's why this is called Elohim. And so you can take that a little further. So for those of you who checked out the Tselem Elokim video on the channel, so you'll already kind of know that the dynamic of Hashem as Elokim is Hashem using this multiplicity of forces and tools to sort of differentiate and manifest all being. And so you can think of it like this, just to sort of make it a little clearer, that the name Elokim is Hashem, is a word that describes Hashem's ability and capacity to manifest within space and time and being. And the name Yud Kei Vav Kei is really Hashem's capacity to be above and beyond space and time and all being, and to be essentially Hashem's not being when he's operating in the Yud Kei Vav Kei mode, or when we experience him through the lens of Yud Kei Vav Kei. It's a clearer way of saying it. Instead, Hashem is the beer. In other words, Hashem is the source of all of those things. So when Hashem is when we experience Hashem through the lens of Yud Kei Vav Kei, he's outside the system and sort of like, manifesting the system from beyond. So whereas when Hashem is operating as Elokim, when we experience Hashem as Elokim, then you can think of it almost as if now Hashem is interacting with being and can actually, interface, and that's actually what you'll see very often. You'll see in the Chumash, in the Torah. So what Hashem does is, whenever Hashem is speaking, so Hashem, by definition, is operating through Elokim. And you're experiencing Hashem through the lens of Elokim. And what's happening there is that the reason why that has to be true is because in order for Hashem to speak, he has to be within time, because speech, by definition, is a time-based action, right? When you're speaking, so you're saying words, and the words one after the other through time, there's change. First one word is being said, then another word is being said, so that's a change. Whenever there's change taking place, by definition, you are now working in the context of time, because you can't have change outside of time. So what's happening there is, you could think of it as like, and even though what you'll find when Hashem is speaking in the Chumash, or when he's doing any other kind of action, anytime Hashem does any kinds of actions, it's always within the framework of time, because that's all it's all concepts of change, right? Actions are also change concepts. So whenever you have that, you'll sometimes find Hashem called Elokim, and sometimes you'll still find Hashem called Yud Kei Vav Kei. And the reason for that, just to clarify that, is because even when Hashem is operating inside of the system of space and time and being, it's still Hashem, the self, that's behind it. And so I just want to give you an analogy to understand what I mean when I say that, and then we'll take that and bring it more towards the problem that we're trying to deal with now in terms of the evolution question and the larger picture. So just as an analogy, so if you look at a person, look at myself, so I do all kinds of different things using my Elohim set of tools. In other words, all the multiplicity and diversity of this set of tools, I'm constantly moving, speaking, doing all kinds of change-oriented things. And so that's kind of like my externality in a certain way. It's that my externalization. It's sort of like the plurality of forces that I was given as a gift by the source of reality, and I use that, and I, the self, use that to do things, to make change happen in the world. So that's the Elohim side of my being. It's like, kind of like the character that I'm playing. But the self, the me, that is using this character to make all those changes happen, so that self is actually timeless. And so for those of you who have checked out the video that I put out about the neshama, what's called the soul in English, people like to translate it as the word soul, which is really the consciousness. So the concept that I tried to express there, at least one aspect of it, was that when you look out through your eyes, so the you that's looking out through the eyes is always the same you. In other words, the self that you are is immutable. You're actually immortal. That's that you that's looking out through the eyes. And so the personality and even some of the memories and some of the body itself and the character that you're playing, like right now, I, the self, am playing the character of Zev Bannet. And so Zev Bannet is just a character. And when the Zev Bannet character is done with its particular manifestation and its job here, so then I will recede from that. And then the options are, I could either come back as a different character, or maybe the Olam Haba phase will start, and then I'll actually be brought back to life, potentially as Zev Bannet again, and live forever. And that's a much longer discussion of what is reincarnation and what exactly happens if you, let's say you, the self, came into the world as multiple characters, and then in the Olam Haba phase when you're living forever, so which one of those characters are you playing then? Like, how does that work? Because, which one comes back to life? So it's obviously a pretty significant question. But the point right now is that it's always the same me looking out through my eyes, whichever age I am. When you were 5, when you were 10, when you were 20, when you were 30, whatever age you are, it's always the same you, that timeless and spaceless you. It's unchanging. You're completely static in terms of the self. And then in terms of all the things that the self does, when it uses the character, it's now interfacing through a series of levels and stages that are a Kabbalistic structure called the Sfirot that translate yourself through the medium of your Elohim set of tools into a presence that can actually influence and create change in the world. And so there's really this hybridization where there's like these two very different things. There's the timeless, spaceless you, the self, that is somehow linked and manifests through a time-based, space-based being that we call the character that you're playing. And so that hybridization of those two very seemingly opposite, contrasting ideas of spaceless and timeless versus space-based and time-based. So that's what a human being essentially has, those two elements. And we talk about Hashem, Yud-Kei, Vav-Kei, and Elohim, it's exactly the same thing. Now, when you're able to sort of wrap your mind around that, which is a longer discussion why we have a hard time with this, but we today don't call Hashem Yud-Kei, Vav-Kei, Elohim. You see that in the Torah, Hashem's not called that, because we have a hard time seeing that today, and there's a variety of reasons why that is, all having to do with the story of the Garden of Eden and what's called the Eitz Hadas Tov Ra, the tree of knowledge of Tov and Ra. So that's really that's what the actual, that's why we don't speak about Hashem in that way now. But that doesn't change the fact that both of those lenses or ways of experiencing Hashem still exist, very much so. So you can experience Hashem as either the plurality of all forces, and essentially it's Hashem's capacity to engage and be involved in time and space and being. And that's Hashem actually being present as a character in the story of time and space and being. And then in the contrast to that, you have Hashem completely timeless, and Hashem, you can encounter Hashem as the being that is not even as the being, as the self that is beyond all being and that is spaceless and timeless. And both of those are 100% true. And somehow there's a way that's very, it's a very sophisticated and complex way in which those two things are able to operate together, even though they are essentially opposites. Now, what comes out of all of that, the most important part as a takeaway for our purposes, is I have to I'll say it as clearly as I can. We operate primarily in the Elohim space. And the reason for that is because our lives are all about change. And to say it a little more clearly, this whole place, the theme, the one thing about this context that we experience, that we live in, is the concept of change. That is the theme of this whole reality. And so the idea that there are things that are static and unchanging is foreign to this environment, which is why it's such a fascinating phenomenon that we talk about Hashem as being unchanging and being beyond, because he's the source of time and space. But we ourselves, like ourself, the self that's looking out through the eyes, is also almost like a foreign body, which is why in a lot of Torah writings you'll find the neshama is described as being a stranger in a strange land. Like you're kind of here and you feel like you don't really belong here because this whole place is like incongruous and incompatible in a certain way with your core essence of being an unchanging, endless, immortal self. And the idea that there's going to be an end and that, you're going to die is very disturbing because you just intuit that, like, you're not supposed to die. It's like, I'm forever. And the truth is you are forever, just the body has this problem that it needs to turn off for a certain period of time. And that's, the question about death. But your intuition is correct. The Torah describes you as you are actually immortal, unchanging, immutable, and endless. And so that intuition is actually right. But the whole context that you were placed into as a foreign object in this stranger in a strange land environment is actually all about change and dynamism and evolution. In other words, the theme of the place, the playground that you were placed in, this place that you're in, is only about change. And what that means, to say that in another way, when I say the word evolution, so that's already where I'm going, evolution actually is much larger than just the biological complexification, if that's a word, complexification of organic beings. Evolution does not just refer to, in the Torah's perspective, does not just refer to the fact that you have biological parts that become more and more and more complicated until they eventually start becoming conscious and self-aware. Evolution is the theme of this whole place. And so, the word for that, by the way, the word for Hashem, in terms of Hashem, Yud Kei Vav Kei, is the word shlemut. Hashem is whole. He's completely whole. There's no room for any kind of evolution or growth there because Hashem is just whole. But on the Elohim side of Hashem's manifestation, so there we have what's called hishtalmut. It's the language of Rav Kook. Hishtalmut means becoming more shalem, becoming more whole. In other words, we are on the side of the equation of the Elohim. And on that side of the equation, the world is all about becoming, evolving, becoming more and more and more. And on the first side, on the Yud Kei Vav Kei side of things, that's all about just static, unchanging, and it's just that, and those two are contrasting. And so, where you primarily operate and live, and where you experience process, so that's the context of evolution and change and dynamism. So that's really what this place is actually all about. So you'll notice that that's essentially why there's this entity called time inside of the system, because time, like we spoke about, if you can try to pull yourself out of being so used to time as such a given because you've always been experiencing time, and look at time as a construct, that it's actually something Hashem had to create and then differentiate this into being. So then when you think about it clearly, what that means is that the construct of time is its whole purpose is essentially to allow space for change. In other words, that's its point. The point of time is to allow space for change to take place. So when you think about that, well, that Hashem designed this whole context to have this feature that there is room for change to take place. And then he created all these rules, and even the word Elohim, which describes Hashem's manifestation of diversity, and all these laws of how this diverse place actually functions, and those laws start to interact with each other, and they lead to greater and greater and greater interactions that increasingly become complex. And so that leads to essentially what we experience now as the world around us. And so that process of constant change and dynamism is actually the root of this whole place. So to suggest that evolution, the idea that there is actually constantly change taking place and that things are just dynamic, is fundamental to what the Torah describes as the purpose of this whole place. Let's go a little deeper, though, just to understand how that relates to evolution with animals, too. The description of these things is that there is a journey of process going on, of evolution, of dynamism. It's not just that there's like a lot of action, almost like haphazard. It's that this actually has a trajectory. This is going someplace. So to use the language of the Maharal, for example, the Maharal talks about how the theme of this place is what he calls, the word is chisaron, which means there's a lack. And then in this place, wherever there's a lack, so then that pulls things towards that lack. And it's true in every different area. So it's polar attractions, like electrical attractions, like all these different types of dynamics of attraction. There's a concept called the law of attraction that's closely related to this. That in some ways true, in some ways not true, but closely related to this idea because people are aware there's just all of these dynamics of attraction taking place. And the trajectory here is that what Hashem is trying to do with this whole process is to, over time, manifest higher and higher and higher states of consciousness / self-awareness. Now, you might be curious as to why Hashem would want to do that, and that's a very fair question. We're not going to answer that question right now, but it's just important to put that out there. But the point of this place is not just random dynamism and random change. It's evolving change towards higher and higher states of consciousness. Now, if you think about that for a second, what we're seeing right now in the world and what human beings actually are is that for the last, according to the scientific theories of evolution, some of which, by the way, the older theories, the original Darwinism is essentially, in a lot of ways, been disproven, but there's much more advanced theories of evolution today that actually make a lot of sense and seem like they're very true, which essentially describe that on the biological playing field, first of all, the general universe, has been going through its unfolding process, but within if you follow the story, the description of the stories of creation in the Chumash, so slowly you move the focus away from the more cosmic things towards the biological playing field. And then you see that in the biological playing field in the scientific world, so there's been an increase in complexity over time, over the last 4, 5, 6 billion years, and really the last 4.5 billion years, an increase in complexity of biology, and through various phases, and then that biological complexity process essentially has been climbing towards more and more and more complex tools until you reach a stage where now the tools are so complex they're actually able to sustain genuine consciousness and genuine self-awareness. And so what you're seeing is that Hashem is essentially unfolding the biological space in such a way that it actually yields consciousness. And again, we're so used to thinking of biology as if it's like, well, that's just animals, and it's just, but all biology actually is manipulation of various atoms, which are just energy that's been condensed into different structures that we call atoms, and then those atoms are interacting according to these tiny, tiny rules that they follow until they eventually create molecular structures, we call it chemical structures, which is really just molecular interaction, and then eventually those things continue to combine and build till they reach like a macro state within the space-time continuum that we experience as this. So that's not something which is problematic in terms of realizing that that's something which is all just part of the theme that's been written about in the Torah and in so many of our writings, that the whole point of this thing is for there to be a greater and greater and greater waking up process, more and more and more awakeness, like I say today, to be woke. That's literally what this is about, to become more and more and more self-aware, more conscious, more intentional, more just operating from a place of genuine awareness and genuine intent. So you sort of know that that's the theme here, and like everything in the Torah is about that. That's not like one of these like, oh, there's like a nice idea here, a nice idea there, and there's just all these different ideas. That is the backdrop for the entire Torah. It is one of the most primary assumptions that you could have that's in the background, just working with everything in the Torah, because it's a given. Like you can't do any mitzvah, you can't do anything that the Torah is describing in the process of what we call avodas Hashem, which really just means essentially becoming more and more and more aware that you are an aspect of Hashem's consciousness. So you can't do any of that process without time and change. It is implied and embedded in the process, but we're just so used to it, and we don't have the contrast of the Yud Kei Vav Kei side to be like, well, there's static non-change, and like we are the changing side of the equation. That's our nature. This whole thing is about the changing side, that it's about moving towards greater and greater and greater awakeness, greater and greater and greater evolution of consciousness, and that requires evolution of the whole universe and definitely the biological space in order to make that possible. So what that kind of leads to is just it sort of undoes the whole question here, because and I think it undoes it in two ways. I mean, one way is just what I'm saying now, which is that obviously this is the whole way it's supposed to work. It's supposed to be like this. And number two is also that we, as the way the Torah describes our being, there was never this idea that the bodies in some way has to be somehow not, related to the rest of the biological world. the Torah's approach to this is that you are not your body. You are a self that uses the body as a set of tools to create context for greater self-awareness. That's true. But like that body, like the way that it came into being, so there's no reason that it can't have come into being as an extension of a process of all of evolutionary biology that we see around us, and that in no way contradicts the Torah at all. Like, it's not even a question of that. Incidentally, the Arizal, among other writers, has a few different pieces where he talks about these types of process orientations. But one is about how the actual the way that if you look at the biological space, so of course there's a trajectory oriented process that's taking place where you have all of life biologically is kind of like similar, and this is what we know this from science in terms of carbon-based life forms. But he's basically like, you have transitions from like more primitive to like more complex, and you have plants that are a little bit like animals because some plants actually eat bugs, and then plants themselves become more complex also, and then you also have different forms of animals that some are more like human being bodies and some are less, and he's like, you see it transition like that. And this is like, it's written a few hundred years ago by the Arizal, and like he wasn't like, oh, this contradicts the Torah. Like there's no question of that, because the more you know the Kabbalah principles here, it never even gets off the ground to think that there is some kind of conflict between these things. So that's the basic background here. And again, there's really that principle itself of change and evolution is itself requires 10-part series about how to understand change and our evolutionary process and what exactly does it mean to become more conscious. And there's a lot to talk about there as well. But in terms of just the basic question of evolution itself and how it interrelates with the Torah, so we are not operating with the same tools as the classic Christian perspective or the more pervasive cultural approach to science and religion. And I think that to set it up that way is just very misleading. I just want to end with one final point here, which is I just want to stress that there is one, I would say, an uncertainty or a caveat to this, which is that it seems like if you actually look at the story of the Garden of Eden in the beginning of the Torah, so that the human beings that were operating that story, they actually have a more advanced consciousness than we currently have. In other words, we're currently operating with a lower state of consciousness called das tov vara, which literally means a perception of reality in which you see reality through the lens of what you're into and what you are apathetic towards. It's a very distorted way of evaluating the reality you live in, because you tend to look at things based on what you're attracted to versus what you are completely disinterested in, as opposed to actually looking at things in terms of their objective intrinsic value. So we have that state of consciousness now because as a result of the mistake of eating from the fruit of this tree called the tree of das tov vara, what's classically translated as the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So, which really just means the tree of perceptions of reality through the lens of what you're interested in and what you're disinterested in. So, the people that existed in the story before the eating of that fruit from that tree, the way the Torah describes it, it seems like they actually had a higher state of consciousness that was not as warped and distorted as our consciousness states are able to become due to this new way of seeing things because of the tree. The reason I'm bringing that up is because I just want to stress it seems like a lot of the distortion patterns of what we call das tov vara from that tree are actually resulting from having biological brains and biological bodies. So as one example of that, we have a very hard time often with actually being active, like especially today. It's this tendency to sort of what we call to be lazy. And a word to describe that is actually just to have inertia. In other words, you tend to constantly slow down, and then if you're sitting, it's like you don't really want to get started moving. Your body has this state of being that it likes to be inert, and it prefers to be at rest. And if you think about that for a second, that's a problem in terms of what we're actually here for, because you are here to be the opposite of at rest. You're here to evolve. You're here to invest and to be active, and yet your body is constantly not allowing you to do that. Your brain has plenty of defects in terms of how it thinks about things. You attach yourself to perspectives and ideas not based on their truth content, but actually based on your emotional attachment to them, which can lead to massive distortions of perception, because you can actually start evaluating the world based on distorted memories of things, and you'll remember all kinds of things because of your emotional attachment to certain ideas, but things that you have no emotional attachment to you won't remember. That's why people can lose their keys but will remember getting made fun of in the 4th grade, because that's what you'll store that in your lenses because it has an emotional meaning to you, but where you left your keys has no emotional meaning, which is ironic given that it probably should have some. And so what that kind of leads to is that it seems like this body is actually part of the problem, and the biological bodies that we have seem to play a very strong role in our actually distorted perspectives. I mean, you take that a little further. So, for example, there's actually a fairly complex, comprehensive statement about the story in the Torah of Parshas Bereshis that's found in the writings of our sages from 2,000 plus years ago, where they talk about how the bodies that we used to have before we ate from the tree were actually much more ethereal, like transparent, like they were much more in the background to the consciousness experience, and we were actually at a much higher state of being where you could actually look at somebody else and you would see the light of their consciousness in all of its multifaceted complexity. And now instead we just see the body, and like you can get a little glimmer of light when you look at someone's eyes, and sometimes when you're in love with someone you can kind of get a sense of their consciousness like that, but these are just glimmers of the light that's actually hidden behind these bodies now. So if that's true, so what that kind of implies is that there's actually an even higher state of consciousness that we have once been, or once manifested, or once expressed, and then we were reduced to having much more biological bodies that are much thicker and much denser now and get in the way of that process of conscious expansion. And so that's something it's important to mention that, because this phase that we're in right now is actually like we're a little bit, struggling with the whole point of why we're here. So, and even the fact that we can sometimes think that we are our bodies is part of that problem. And so that's an important thing to just mention, to understand that there's actually a higher state of evolution that we once had potentially and will have again, and that we'll be able to reach greater and higher states of conscious expression through these things as we journey through the evolutionary process of our lives. So that's sort of how to think about evolution, I would say. And by the way, that's it's a long-term evolution. It's supposed to keep going forever. You're going to keep evolving. It's called in the Gemara, you're supposed to be going mechayil el chayil, like from one success to the next. And there's no end to that real evolution and growth as we live forever using tools that are more advanced than this. But so far we're still stuck with this setup, and that's why it has all those distortions. But again, even this setup is still a part of the process of the trajectory of evolution that we're talking about in terms of the Torah's evolution, not just the biological evolutionary process. Okay, hope that was relatively clear and useful. And so check out the channel, check out some of the other videos, and this should be the end of the series about the Big Bang. Have awesome days.